Let's talk tourism.
Juan Carlos Hidalgo is perhaps best known as a Costa Rican journalist focused on economics and politics, but more recently, he's thrown his hat into the ring of politics as a candidate for Congress in the Costa Rican government. He grew up in San Carlos, studied later at George Mason University, and worked for over a decade in the United States before returning home to Costa Rica. He's got a love affair with English football, and all around is a pretty fun guy to get a pint with. Juan Carlos, let's talk tourism.
Hi, Casey. Thanks for having me.
Thrilled to have you. I'm not normally a huge fan of politicians, but you're a bit of an outsider, and you're my first quasi-political guest. You spent a ton of time in the United States before you came home to Costa Rica. While you were in the U.S., mostly in Virginia, correct?
Indeed, Washington, D.C.
When you told people you were from Costa Rica, what was the first general impression you got?
I think Costa Rica has a very positive view outside in the world. I remember that particularly during the World Cup in 2014, we were the sabor of the mess. We were like the most popular people around because Costa Rica was doing great in the World Cup, and I would get into a cup, and it could be like somebody from Ethiopia or something, and they will ask me like, where are you from? And I will say I'm from Costa Rica, and they will be thrilled. Oh, Costa Rica, your team is doing so well in the World Cup. But yeah, generally people really like Costa Rica. I remember another time we were in Paris with my wife. We were holidaying, and we went to a restaurant, and the guy asked me like, where are you from? And I said Costa Rica, and he said, oh, I would love to visit, but it's too expensive. And then I realized that we are also building up another sort of fame that is not necessarily positive, that we're a expensive place for a destination. But overall, I was always very pleased with the way that people reacted. I'm also a big fan of Live. I don't know if you remember, you're from Pennsylvania. Yeah. I don't remember if you remember Live, the rock band from the 1990s.
Sure.
Once I went to see them at the 930 Club in DC. And afterwards, I went backstage to meet them. I got a ticket to meet the guys. And it was interesting because the drummer, Chad Gracie, was just returning from Costa Rica from spending 2 weeks in Nosara. And Chad Taylor's wife, who was a yoga professor, and he told me that she spends half the time, or she used to spend half the time here in Costa Rica. So there you go. I mean, we have a very good image outside in the world. And I think we have to take the most use of it.
That is a fact. Very interesting. I forgot that Live was from York, Pennsylvania for a moment there. So obviously you returned to Costa Rica. You must have missed a few things. What were the biggest things you missed about Tiquicia during your time up north?
Well, friends and family. And speaking in Spanish, you don't know what you have until you lose it. And the fact that you're even though Washington is a very international city, and my boss was half Peruvian, my assistant was Argentinian. I have other colleagues at Cato that had spoke Spanish as their native language. So I will speak in Spanish most of the time at work. But still, for anything that you need, like if you go to a store, if you have to do something in, taking a cab or whatever, the fact that you're not speaking your native language and all that comes with it, it's not just speaking per se, but also the jokes, and the attitude and the Pura Vida.
Right.
I definitely missed that. And perhaps the moment I missed the most Costa Rica was during the World Cup in 2014, looking at at the footage of hundreds of thousands of Costa Ricans in the streets celebrating the victories of the national team. Oh, that was really hard to swallow. I was in DC, and we gathered there like 200 Costa Ricans to watch the games. It was fantastic, but it wasn't the same. But it was interesting, Casey, because I was concerned when I made the decision of coming back home. I was concerned about the return, and actually there is a movie. I think I don't know what's El Regreso. Yeah, I was kind of concerned about the Regreso, waking up the next day and saying, oh. I'm no longer in the U.S. All the comforts that you could have there are no longer here. But then I came back and I was expecting that shock, and it never came. I was immediately back, and not only in body but also in mind. And this is the moment I'm still enjoying every moment. I just had my first burger just a couple of weeks ago. I hadn't even have burgers or French fries or anything, because I'm enjoying Costa Rican food so much that I don't want to miss a chifrijo or something just to eat a burger.
And you were gone during a pretty interesting development period for Costa Rica. What surprised you when you came back?
Well,
In terms of the changes of the country, because the change accelerated quite a bit here during the decade that you were gone. I mean, was there anything you're like, wow, at least Chepe, the San Jose Central?
yeah, indeed,
changed?
the skyline changed a bit. We have all these big, tall buildings. Maybe one of them can be called as sky scraper.
Yeah.
But yeah, the skyline is quite different. That's perhaps the most novel feature of San Jose. But other than that, I mean, I think that the infrastructure is still in a pretty bad shape. And the politics is pretty much the same. It hasn't changed much. I was coming here all the time. I would come home for 4 times, 5 times a year. So I was in detached of whatever was happening here. But yeah, I didn't have time to appreciate during my visits some things like, yeah, how the city per se is changing. You were always amazed on those long running businesses that were gone, that are no longer here. What happened to this restaurant? Oh, it's gone. What happened to Rio here in Los Joseph? Well, that one closed while I was here already. But that's perhaps the most shocking feature about being back and seeing changes in the city.
Growing up in a rural part of northern Costa Rica, Ciudad Quesada, San Carlos, you had to have had some early experience with tourism, no? I mean,
Indeed.
It's a pretty major part of life up there. What was your first experience or awareness of tourism and tourists in Costa Rica?
Well, perhaps was the fact that my elder cousin Mauricio, he started working very young, in a very young age. He migrated to San Jose and he started working in the ICT, the Costa Rican Institute of Tourism. And it was a very interesting time for tourism. I think that was in the late 1980s or early 1990s, when Costa Rica was becoming, was starting to get known outside for in terms of tourism. And so that was my first experience then. And then my mom, when I was in high school, she started working for my cousin. Actually, he started a travel agency, and my mom started working for him. And that's when like I got very immersed in tourism world, because my mom was working there and my cousin, and so it was kind of like in the family.
And have you had much experience enjoying Costa Rica as a tourist yourself? Have you traveled? Do you know the country pretty well?
I wish I had traveled more. I've been around, yeah, but perhaps not much as a tourist, but as now as a politician, that I visit in places. I'm discovering places that should be more in the radar when it comes to tourism, like Juárez, for example, which is beautiful. It's a rural county in San Jose that has a lot of potential for tourism, but they're just starting. They need to be better known. But yeah, I wish I were experiencing more of my country in a tourist capacity than what I am. Now that my wife is here and she's from the US, we're looking forward to being done with this part of the campaign, which is going to be over by the June 27. So I hope that we'll take a couple of weeks to take her around and as tourists, and so she can enjoy more of the country. So far, we haven't been able to do that since we came back from DC.
In terms of Costa Rica's, international fame or reputation in tourism, what do you think are some of the things that the country has done right? What are the things? How did we get here? What do you think sustained the success up to this point?
We have a brand. We have a very successful brand, as I mentioned earlier. People have a positive reaction when you utter the words Costa Rica. They think about nature, and I think that we have done a very good job at positioning Costa Rica as an ecotourism destination, even though there are several challenges when it comes to our green image. For example, the treatment of sewage. 85% of the sewage in Costa Rica goes to the rivers and to the oceans untreated. That's a calamity that we need to address in the near future. But people think about beaches, people think about volcanoes, people think about how Costa Rica has 3% of the world's biodiversity. And we are only, despite that tourism is one of our major industries or the most successful industry, we still have so much potential to grow. And I like to emphasize the example of Guanacaste. Back in 2014, Guanacaste had 36% of poverty, the province. The national average has been around 20% for over 20 years. But in a matter of 6 years, the poverty rate in Guanacaste went down from 36% to below 20%, below the national average. And almost all of that had to do with tourism, how Guanacaste became the standard bearer of tourism in the country. Well, we need to replicate that in other parts of the country. I was mentioning Turu Juarez earlier. Well, I don't think Turu Juarez is in the radar of anyone talking about tourism right now, but it has a lot of potential. But we need to do that in the Caribbean. We need to do that in the southern part of the country, Central Pacific. Then La Fortuna, where I'm in San Carlos, where I'm from, is also a very successful region when it comes to tourism. But yeah, nature, number one, but also the political stability that we have enjoyed for several decades. I remember watching Alf. You remember Alf back in the 1980s? Well, I remember watching Alf, and at some point, the kid in the show said that he was, I think Alf was having nightmares or something like that. And in his nightmare, the kid came out wearing fatigues, like a soldier. And he asked him, "Where are you going?" And he said, "I'm going to the wars in Central America." And wow, that's kind of the political statement coming from Alf. But I was thinking, well, we're not part of that. Central America being such a turbulent region, and it still is. We became the oasis of peace, oasis of democracy, oasis of stability. And that also is part of the brand that we have. Now, we have to fight other things that are undermining that image. And we have to fight insecurity, which is becoming more of a problem. We have to fight that impression that we're an expensive destination. It doesn't have to be that. I know that some people think that, well, we're expensive because we're good. And it's kind of like a prime that people pay in order to visit us. Well, it doesn't have to be that way. We are artificially expensive, and we can lower the cost and become more attractive to more and more tourists.
I want to jump ahead at some point here and ask you what you think, the government needs to do, if anything. But the first question I have is, through all this crisis, and God willing, it looks like we're exiting the worst of that. There seems to be an impression amongst the tourism industry that the industry is a bit like the forgotten housewife, while the government is eyeballing maybe younger, sexier industries like tech, or maybe there's always the more traditional things like agriculture. What do you think the government misunderstands about tourism, or where's the disconnect?
I don't know. That really puzzles me. Maybe it's the fact that several governments, and we're not talking continuous governments, and we're not talking about just this one, but throughout the years, they think that tourism is an industry that is going to always be there, that doesn't require much attention, doesn't require chineos, as we say in here in Costa Rica in Spanish. It doesn't require sweeteners, although in the past there were incentives to the hotel industry and others. But you said it, free trade zones and tech manufacturing and agriculture, they get a lot of attention from the authorities. And I think that given the fact that tourism is not only a very vigorous industry, dynamic industry, but the fact the nature of tourism itself, in the sense that it's a very democratic industry. I mean, people who make a living out of tourism, you know, the wealth spreads around, to use that term coined by Obama. And it spreads around particularly where you need it the most, which is the coast, the rural areas. One of the major challenges that Costa Rica is facing is the growing disparity between the rural areas and the urban Central Valley. You're creating jobs here. You're not creating much jobs outside San Jose and the Central Valley. And we need to address that. Well, tourism, where is the most vigorous, where is the most dynamic, where is the most attractive, is precisely in the rural areas, precisely in the coast. And if we want to create opportunities for people to find jobs in those places, well, we need to give tourism its rightful place. And I think that.
So what kind of ideas do you have? What have you seen? And I think I understand a little bit of your political leanings. So rather than us begging for all this help and handouts and bailouts, how can the government at least hurt us less or make it a little easier for us to help ourselves?
Well, I think that all the economy, not only tourism, needs structural reforms to become more competitive. We know for a fact which are the areas where the productive sector, the private sector, is hurt the most. One of them is the cost of labor cost. It's not that labor is expensive in Costa Rica, but the fact that the labor taxes, which are the highest in Latin America and among the highest within the OECD. And remember that the OECD is a club of mostly rich countries. So we have labor taxes in Costa Rica that are too expensive, even in the context of industrialized nations. So I think that that's an area that needs to be addressed, and not only for tourism, that's for everyone, But the fact that tourism is so labor intensive, obviously, is one of the industries that is set to gain the most if we lower labor taxes. I think that we should also lower their corporate tax rate in Costa Rica, which is 30%, is again higher than the average in Latin America, higher than the average, significantly higher than the average in the OECD. We need to lower it to be more competitive. I think that we need to lower the cost of electricity. Tourism is an industry that is very intensive when it comes to energy consumption. And for that, we need to open up the market here and what I call democratize energy production. That is, that if an industry, a particular industry, a particular household or particular business wants to have its own source of energies, independent from the ICE, from the state-owned monopoly, that they should be able to do so. And infrastructure. And I know that this is a topic that hurts all Costa Rica, but I think that just as in the 19th century and the early 20th century, we built roads and railroads in order to export produce outside the country, we need to build infrastructure in the 21st century, starting in the second decade of the 21st century, for tourism. We need good roads where tourists like to go. We need good access points. We need to have airports, regional airports. We need to have cruise ports for cruises, etc. So I think that's the main focus that I will give tourism. And also, as I understand, and I've talked to people who are involved in the industry, also lots of money for promotion, for publicity outside the country. That is always important.
Never hurts. It never hurts.
Never hurts, indeed.
Where did your political views come from? When were they formed? Did you know who you were politically before you got to the United States? Was it a book? Was it a specific political leader? Was it a parent? I mean, where did you find your political beliefs?
Well, I always liked politics, and actually, there is a tape when I was 3 years old that my mom taped that where I'm discussing Nicaragua. I'm discussing politics in Nicaragua, and I'm not talking about Daniel Ortega, who like almost 40 years later is still in power. You know?
Yeah, same headlines.
But so I was always interested in politics and world affairs. When I went to college, I studied international relations with one of the professors said that it's a sea of knowledge with a centimeter of depth. You know, you learn about diplomacy, you learn about history, international law, economics, etc., but you never become an expert on any of those topics. And he encourages to go find a job. They say, like, while you're studying, you should be working somewhere. You know, it doesn't matter whether you're getting paid or not, you're getting work experience, and that's something that that's going to benefit you in the future. So I took his word for it, and I asked an aunt of mine who was very close to the recently elected congressman from San Carlos, from the party I belong to right now, and asked him if I could work for him for free in Congress. So that's how I started working in Congress. But this guy shared the same office complex with Otto Guevara, the guy who was also recently elected congressman from the Libertarian Party back then. So I started hearing Otto Guevara talk about free markets and competition and opening up monopolies and lowering taxes and all that. And I became really attracted to his ideas. So one day I talked to him, and he gave me some literature. I read it. I liked what I saw and read, and I asked him if I could switch and start working for him. And that's how I was introduced to classical liberalism. And then I applied for an internship in DC in 2002 for a libertarian think tank, the Competitive Enterprise Institute. And after that internship, there was an opening at the Cato Institute. They were looking for someone to run their Spanish website. And I talked to them, and they hired me, and the rest is history. I stayed in Washington it was just a year and a half back then. Then I came back to Costa Rica for 2 years, and then I returned in 2006 for my master's. And then I started working at Cato again in 2007. But that's how I became a classical liberal. I consider myself one, although I have to admit that my views have evolved in some sense. I'm not as radical as I used to be. I think that has to do a lot with age. You know, when you're young, you like radical ideas, but then you become more pragmatic, and you see that in certain areas, you have to take into account the culture, the history of a country. You cannot try to import economic models that don't have a historical, cultural background in the country where you're discussing, or that you want to improve the lots of the people.
Sure, someone once said politics is downstream from culture, right? So do you think there's room in a country who culturally is like a big family in a lot of ways? I think part of what makes Costa Rica so great is it almost feels like one big farm. And to that end, I think there's a lot of cooperative and some of those notions, particularly with our more social safety net side, is what made Costa Rica great up to this point. But in certain ways now, it's pretty clearly choking the system in some ways. I think we're going to see that very plainly as tourism rebounds, at the hesitancy of the industry to rehire. Is there a place culturally for a country that is very much, I guess you'd say, center left traditionally? Is there a place for center right ideas?
I think so. And I like the example of Ireland. Ireland was a country where economic institutions were somewhat similar to Costa Rica. I think that they are like 20 or 30 years ahead on the economic history that we've been through.
Yeah.
After independence, they turned their market to themselves. They became very nationalistic. Of course, they didn't want to do anything with Britain, but with the rest of the world. So they adopted import substitution back since the 1920s. That was like 30 years before we adopted the same model. Then they had to deal with the model that is pretty much what we have now, which is a dual economy, in the regards that you have a very competitive, dynamic sector that has to do with exports, that has to do with free trade zones and so on. But then the rest of the economy is highly inefficient and highly uncompetitive. That was what happened to Ireland back in the 1960s up to the 1980s. Yeah. And then they open up, and then they lower taxes. They open up for investment, or they adopted the famous or infamous, whatever your take on it, is the tax rate of 12.5%, which is an article of faith for the political class in Ireland. And they went from being the third poorest nation in Western Europe to being the second richest in a matter of 20 years. So I think that we can look at that example, because the fact that, yeah, we've been center-left, that we have a big welfare state, the fact that we always emphasize that safety net over, if we have to choose whether we want general welfare state with a safety net over a competitive economy, I think most people will say that they prefer the former, but that doesn't have to do the case, that you don't have to choose between one or the other. You can have a strong safety net, you can have generous pensions, you can have a strong healthcare system, and have a competitive economy. I'm even going to go farther. The only way you can finance a strong, robust welfare state is if you have a private sector that is strong and dynamic enough to pay the taxes and to sustain the welfare state. So that's just the message I'm trying to convey to people. You don't have to choose between a strong welfare state or a competitive economy. You can have both.
Yeah, I think the Irish analogy works in a lot of ways from an agrarian society. Mm-hmm. Even though we're not an island, in a lot of ways we are here in Costa Rica. Yeah. And I also think there are probably some missteps in terms of them overheating their economy that Costa Rica would need to look at. Last question. The grand mystery of that's often asked about Costa Rica, and I'm sure you heard this a bunch while you were in the US. What's Pura Vida? What is it? How do you answer that in a couple sentences?
Pura Vida is a mindset. It's a way of living. It's an attitude. I think it's the best possible slogan for a country out there. Costa Rica is Pura Vida. You don't need to say anything else. You don't need to explain it, because you live it. You experience it. People who come here, they don't have to spend more than a couple of days to realize what Pura Vida is.
And do you think we're at risk of losing it, or has it been eroded?
I think that there are some aspects of life that, of course, go against what Pura Vida stands for. The stress in the cities, when you see the traffic outside and people losing their temper, because they're dealing with traffic lines that it takes them like a couple hours to go to work or come back home. The violence, of course, drug trafficking, corruption, that all goes against the Pura Vida that we're so proud of. But I think those are solvable problems. I mean, they're not easy to solve, of course, but we need to tackle them. And we have something great that we need to protect, and is that Pura Vida, and how proud we feel about it.
It's interesting you mentioned how one's political views evolve over time. Costa Rica's center leftedness has definitely dragged me in that direction on a lot of things. But one of the other things that has been a pleasant, oftentimes what is initially a weakness can become a strength. I think perhaps historically one of those for Costa Rica was the benefit of not having any gold. So we didn't have this terrible civil history with a dominating Spanish class dragging all the gold out. But more recent years, Costa Rica's debt structure and view of banking and public finance is very different than a lot of the world. And for I've been down here 2 decades, for the first half of that period, there was almost no access to business or personal credit. Now, in the last few years, that's definitely loosened up. And it's fascinating to see what that's done here in terms of the price of things.
Yeah.
What is your view, having gone from developing country, first world country, seeing everyone spending credit cards like crazy, buying new cars and in debt, huge televisions, to now seeing a little bit of that getting imported here? What's your take on that? I mean, has consumer culture and addiction to credit, is that starting to take hold in Costa Rica?
Yes, that's a very worrisome feature of a country. And I go back to the example of Ireland. Look at what happened to Ireland in the mid 2000s, the mid noughties. A society that was historically poor, all of a sudden was rich and with access to lots of credit. And you have a property boom in the case of Ireland. And then the country went through its worst crisis in history. But yeah, that's something we need to be particularly careful of. I see it in Chile too. Societies that improve their lot and then start having access to credit, which is a new feature for them, it's something new. They don't know how to handle it. And then you see people engaging in very responsible behavior. And you see financial institutions encouraging that behavior. And then it always ends up bad. It ends up with people not being able to pay back their loans, losing their houses, or having most of their salaries consumed by paying debts. In the case of Costa Rica, we have a problem with people over-indebted, who are over-indebted, and we need to see how we tackle it. But I like to analyze it always as a policy analyst myself. I like to analyze it from a historical point of view and compare it to other countries. I think this is not particularly just Costa Rica, but it's something that for some reason happens to societies as they become rich, and then they have access to credit, they have access to banking, and banks act in a very irresponsible, not only banks, other financial institutions. Even here in Costa Rica, you see consumer goods stores giving credit to people, and then people are not able to pay back their flat screens or fridges or whatever, Yeah. So we need to be careful with that, for sure.
Definitely. I mean, and I think you and I are of similar views regarding economics. Real wealth can only come through increased productivity, not accumulation of assets in asset bubbles.
Indeed.
So
I never had a credit card in my life, ever. The only time I had a debt was when I put braces, and that was the only time. And it's funny because in the US, either you have a credit card or you don't have credit history.
Right.
But I managed without a credit card all my life. And when we moved to the last apartment we have there, the last townhouse, they asked Christina for her credit history, and she obviously had. But they asked for mine, and I was like, well, I don't have a credit score because I don't have a credit history. I don't have a credit card. And they asked me, how do we know that you are,
credit worthy?
Yeah, exactly. And I said, well, you know what? I'm almost 40. I don't have any debts. I have savings. I think that's the best credit history you can get,
It's funny, right? Sometimes no credit history is not a good thing. Listen, I don't want to take any more of your time. I know you're a busy man. Best of luck with the election results. And it's always a blast talking with you. And hope we get to do this again soon.
Thank you very much. I really enjoy it, and hope to see you soon.
Have a great week. Good luck.
Let's talk tourism.